Imagine you're a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt and you've just been handed the most disturbing assignment of your career. The pharaoh's wife lies before you on the marble slab. But this isn't a normal mummification. You've been ordered to preserve her body in a way that defies every sacred tradition you've ever known. And the reason makes your blood run cold. This wasn't fiction. This was daily reality in ancient Egypt, where intimate practices were so extreme they would traumatize modern minds. You think you know about Egyptian civilization, the golden treasures, the magnificent pharaohs, the mysterious pyramids. Here's what they don't teach you in school. Ancient Egypt had sexual practices so extreme that Victorian archaeologists literally hid the evidence, where royal children were subjected to horrific abuse by their own families, and where religious festivals turned into week-long orgies of violence and sexual chaos. What I'm about to show you will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Because the truth about Egyptian intimate practices is so disturbing that museums around the world tried to hide the evidence for over a century. Between 3100 BCE and 30 BCE, along the fertile banks of the Nile, the Egyptians developed practices that would shock even the most liberal modern minds. This wasn't just about personal pleasure or religious ceremony. It was about cosmic control, divine power, and the systematic use of sexuality as a weapon of political domination. The pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods whose intimate performance was believed to directly control the fertility of the Nile, the success of harvests, and the survival of Egyptian civilization itself. This created enormous pressure to prove divine potency through increasingly extreme displays. The evidence comes from temple inscriptions that tourists never see, papyrus documents describing practices too explicit for museum displays, and archaeological discoveries that Victorian scholars deliberately concealed from public view. When 19th century archaeologists first uncovered explicit imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they were so scandalized that they either destroyed the evidence or locked it away in private collections. Egyptian society operated on the principle that sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every act of intimacy was potentially a religious ritual. Every orgasm, a conversation with the gods. Every sexual position, a form of prayer. This belief system created a culture where the boundaries between worship and intimacy, between religious duty and personal pleasure, completely disappeared. But this cosmic sexuality came with a dark side. Children born into elite families found themselves trapped in a system that treated their bodies as religious property. Domestic slaves faced systematic sexual abuse that was considered not just legal but religiously necessary. And when things went wrong, when the Nile didn't flood or crops failed, the sexual practices became increasingly desperate and violent. The discovery that changed everything happened not in some dramatic tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team was conducting the first detailed examination of Tutankhamun's mummy when they noticed something that would haunt Egyptology for the next century. The boy king's genitals were missing, not damaged, not decayed, but surgically removed with the precision of a skilled physician. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made shortly after death as part of the mummification process. But Tutankhamun wasn't alone. As more royal mummies were examined using increasingly sophisticated techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of genital removal or modification. Some had been completely castrated. Others showed signs of enhancement procedures involving the insertion of foreign materials. The most shocking discovery came from the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. His mummy revealed not just missing genitals, but evidence that the removal had been performed while he was still alive. Medical analysis of the bone structure and tissue remains suggested this was not a punishment or accident, but a deliberate religious procedure. Ancient Egyptian texts began to make disturbing sense. References to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife. Descriptions of preparing the body for eternal service to the gods. And instructions for modifying the deceased to ensure proper spiritual function in the next world. The implications were staggering. If the Egyptians were routinely modifying the genitals of their dead, what did this say about their attitudes towards sexuality? In the human body, were these modifications purely post-mortem, or did they reflect practices performed on the living as well? But perhaps most disturbing of all was the systematic way Victorian archaeologists had hidden this evidence. When early Egyptologists encountered explicit sexual imagery or evidence of genital modification, they didn't just ignore it. They actively suppressed it, removing artifacts from public view and editing descriptions out of official reports. For over a century, the true extent of Egyptian sexual practices has been concealed not by ancient secrecy, but by modern shame and Victorian prudishness that couldn't accept what the evidence clearly showed. But the missing genitals were just the beginning of what archaeologists found. The Egyptian sexual control system operated through a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of intimate life. At the top were the pharaohs whose sexual performance was considered vital to Egypt's survival. Below them, nobles and priests faced enormous pressure to prove their worthiness through sexual displays and religious devotion. At the bottom were domestic slaves, particularly children, who faced systematic abuse that was not just tolerated but religiously mandated. Royal children born into this system faced a particularly horrific fate. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how elite families would dedicate their youngest children to temple service, where they would be trained in sexual techniques from an early age. These children, some as young as 6 or 7, were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the gods. The training was comprehensive and brutal. Children learned specific positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and methods for maintaining arousal during extended religious ceremonies. They were taught to dissociate from their own physical sensations, to view their bodies as instruments rather than personal property. Medical papyri describe the physical toll this training took on young bodies. Children developed chronic injuries from forced flexibility training. Their growth was often stunted by poor nutrition designed to maintain childlike proportions preferred by adult clients. Many died from internal injuries or infections related to premature intimate activity. But the abuse extended far beyond temple training. Wealthy Egyptian families routinely used their domestic slaves for pleasure, with children being particularly prized for their supposed purity and malleability. Legal documents show that child slaves could be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, with their value determined by age, appearance, and training. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors who lived to adulthood showed symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma. They had difficulty forming normal relationships, often became sexually compulsive or completely withdrawn, and frequently died young from what ancient texts euphemistically called broken hearts. Perhaps most disturbing was how this abuse was justified through religious doctrine. Priests taught that sexual service to the gods was the highest form of worship, that children chosen for such service were blessed rather than victimized, Families were encouraged to feel honored when their children were selected for temple duties, even when they understood the true nature of what would happen. The economic dimension added another layer of horror. Archaeological evidence shows a 73% mortality rate among temple children, with medical analysis revealing procedures that took up to 6 hours to complete. Wealthy patrons paid premium prices for access to child slaves, funding a systematic industry of abuse that lasted for millennia. But if you think that's the worst thing Egyptian children faced, you're not ready for what's coming next. This systematic abuse was nothing compared to what happened during the Feast of Drunkenness, Egypt's most notorious religious festival. What I'm about to reveal involves practices so extreme that when early archaeologists discovered evidence, they literally burned the documents rather than translate them for public consumption. What I'm about to describe will make everything you just heard seem like a children's story. The next practice combines religious worship with sexual violence on a scale that would shock even modern audiences. It involved an entire civilization descending into week-long orgies of chaos. And the archaeological evidence proves it really happened exactly as the ancient sources describe. Before we dive into the most disturbing part, hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next. And definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the